listening to the Chapter a Day Bible Study. I'm John Stange, and today we're in 1 Samuel 29. The Philistines reject David from going to battle with them. There are moments in life when a closed door feels like a crushing disappointment. We may have prayed, prepared, and believed we were heading in the right direction, only to watch the opportunity disappear. In those moments, I think it's easy to wonder whether God has forgotten us or whether our plans have maybe somehow failed. But 1 Samuel 29 reminds us that God often protects his people through closed doors that they don't yet understand. Now, at this point in David's life, he had been living among the Philistines for over a year. He was fleeing Saul's relentless spirit, and he sought refuge with Achish, king of Gath. And while David secretly attacked Israel's enemies, Achish believed that David had completely defected from Israel and become permanently loyal to the Philistines. And now the Philistines were gathering for a massive battle against Israel, and David found himself marching right alongside them. It was an impossible situation. If David fought against Israel, he would betray God's people and destroy his own future as Israel's king. If he turned against the Philistines during the battle, he'd likely be killed immediately. Humanly speaking, there seemed to be no good outcome, and yet God had already planned a way of escape. As the Philistine army assembled, the commanders noticed David and his men marching with Achish, and their response was immediate and emphatic. In verse 3, they said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" Achish then defended David, insisting that David had faithfully served him. In verse 6, we read, "As the Lord lives, you have been honest. And to me it seems right that you should march out and in with me in the campaign. For I have found nothing wrong in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, the Lords do not approve of you." The Philistine commanders were not convinced. They remembered David's reputation far better than Achish seemed to remember. Years earlier, Israel celebrated David's victories with the famous song that's quoted here in verse 5 that said, "Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s." So to them, inviting Israel's greatest warrior right into this battle with them was madness. They feared that David would turn against them in the middle of the fight. And ironically, their suspicion became God's means of rescuing David. Achish reluctantly sent David home. In verse 7, he said this, "Now then, go in peace, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines." David protested outwardly, maintaining his cover before Achish, but the outcome was exactly what God intended. David and his men returned to Ziklag instead of fighting against Israel. Now, initially, when you're first reading this chapter, the chapter might seem like little more than just a chapter of military logistics. But beneath the surface, we actually see God's hand of providence at work. God isn't mentioned as speaking through a prophet or performing a miracle in this chapter. We don't see parted seas. We don't see dramatic signs from heaven, nothing like that. But instead, God works through the decisions and the fears and the disagreements of pagan military leaders in this passage. And interestingly, this is often how the Lord works in our lives. Think about it. Sometimes his providence isn't dramatic. It's subtle. He redirects us through conversations and circumstances and disappointments, or even the objections of people who don't know him, people who don't even have a relationship with him. And what feels like rejection today may actually be God's protection for tomorrow. How many regrets do you suppose we've been spared because God closed a door that we desperately wanted opened? David probably couldn't fully appreciate what was happening in the moment. I think from his perspective, he had been publicly rejected and then sent away in disgrace. But had he entered that battle, the consequences would have been devastating. He might have been forced to fight his own people, or damage his credibility forever, or even lose his life. So God's no was actually an act of mercy. And the chapter also reminds us that God keeps his promises, even when his people make questionable decisions. It could have been argued that David never should have been living among the Philistines in the first place because he went there out of fear. We see that back in 1 Samuel 27:1. And yet God's covenant with David didn't depend on David's flawless judgment. The Lord remained faithful, despite David's imperfect choices. Well, that's encouraging for every believer. Our mistakes are real, and they often carry consequences. But God's faithfulness is greater than our failures. He remains committed to accomplishing his purposes in the lives of those who belong to him. And this chapter points us beautifully toward Jesus. Like David, Jesus was rejected by those around him. But unlike David, Jesus' rejection wasn't because of misunderstanding or political suspicion. He was rejected despite living a perfectly righteous life. Isaiah prophetically foretold this reality in Isaiah 53. He said, "He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief." The religious leaders rejected Jesus. The crowds abandoned him. Even his disciples fled. And even though he was completely innocent, he was treated as an enemy. And yet that rejection wasn't outside God's plan. The cross looked like defeat, but it became the very means through which God accomplished salvation. So what appeared to be history's greatest tragedy, it actually became history's greatest victory. David was rejected by the Philistines so he wouldn't have to stand against God's people. Jesus was rejected by his own people so he could stand in the place of sinners and reconcile them to God. And unlike David, Jesus willingly entered the battle that none of us could fight. He faced sin, death, and Satan head on. Through his death and his resurrection, he secured the victory that we could never achieve ourselves. And because of Christ, we can trust God's providence even when we don't understand it. Closed doors aren't always signs of God's displeasure. Sometimes they're evidence of his loving protection. Delays aren't necessarily denials. Rejection isn't always failure. The Lord sees what we can't see, and he orchestrates circumstances according to his perfect wisdom. So if you're facing some form of disappointment today, please remember 1 Samuel 29. God may actually be rescuing you from something that you don't yet recognize. The opportunity you lost may have led to compromise. The relationship that ended may have prevented greater heartache. The plan that somehow unraveled may have actually made room for something far better. The God who was quietly guiding David through the decisions of unbelieving rulers is the same God who sovereignly directs the lives of his children today. So trust him when the doors close. Some have said that his providence is most active when his hand seems least visible. Because Jesus has secured your future through his finished work, you can rest confidently, knowing that every step of your journey is held in the hands of a faithful Savior. Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Chapter a Day Bible Study. For more resources to help you in your walk with Christ and your understanding of the Bible, please visit my website at BibleStudyHeadquarters.com. And if you'd like to partner with me by becoming a supporter of this ministry, you'll see a few options to do so, again, at BibleStudyHeadquarters.com or in the description of this episode. As always, thank you for your prayers, thank you for your support, and thank you for your willingness to share this content with others. Have a great day, and I'll see you again right here tomorrow.